Greetings to everybody. Today, our guest is Dr. Rachel, Professor Dr. Rachel Jenkins. She will be talking on climate change, biodiversity, and mental health. She is an old friend of mine, and she has worked in the Ministry of Health of United Kingdom. And she is interested. She has also worked on the Institute of Psychiatry. In the recent decades, she is more interested in policy, research, and also training of uh, health personnel. Uh, I have, I should have lots of things to say about her. This is a very brief introduction. I will pass this moderation to our young friend Ferhat Hüseyinov and leave the floor for Rachel Jenkins. Ferhat, would you like to say anything before our guest starts?
No, I just if any other attendants have any questions, they can type that to chat or try to ask. I will try to direct them to Dr. Rachel if she missed them. Yeah, you can start, Dr. Rachel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bülent and Fahad. Right, I'll just try and share my screen. Here we go. Um, ah, there, that. Um, Hopefully that's showing. Right, so I'm going to take us sort of gently through climate change, then biodiversity, and then the mental health consequences as far as we know. But just to get us all on the same page, because I think we all have a big understanding that climate change is here with us and seems to be moving rather fast. But anyway, in putting together this talk, there's a lot that I learned that I hadn't known before. So the climate's changed naturally before. This is important to understand. And for example, during the time of the dinosaurs, the climate was several degrees warmer and there were forests in Antarctica. And then in a much more recent period, just over 100,000 years ago, again, the UK, for example, was much warmer and we had hippos and water buffalo and lions and so on living in Britain. And then after the recent ice ages, when the land was frozen for thousands of years with sort of glaciers across the country, the temperatures warmed up again, but slowly at a rate of about 4 to 7 degrees centigrade over 5 to 10,000 years. And today we've got more than 1, nearly 2 degrees centigrade warming over the last 160 years, and most of it in the last 50 years. So the warming now is going much, much faster than it ever did before. And the last 11 years, as you know, have been the warmest years on record, and last year was the hottest year on record. Um, in the county where I live in a very remote rural area, if you like, on the border between England and Wales. And we have some ice age ponds over when the glaciers melted 10,000 years ago. And these ponds are very valuable geological time capsules. So we can take core samples down through the mud, and they give us an insight into how Herefordshire climate has changed over thousands of years. And the pollen collected in these core samples from the pond sediment show how the land was colonized by different species of tree as the temperature warmed up. So first of all, we got beech and juniper trees. Then there was cooling again, and then there was even more warming, and we got our oak, hazel, and elm trees. So we have a variety of places where we can get evidence about what grew where, when, at what stage in the distant past. Now, there are natural changes to the climate. There's something called the Milankovitch cycle caused by the Earth's tilt as it rotates around the sun, and that changes every 100. And then we're all familiar with the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is this pattern of changing water temperatures in the Pacific. So that in an El Nino year, the temperature warms up, and in an El Nino year, the temperature cools down. And these effects just last a few months or a few years. And we've just had an El Nino, and we're sort of hoping things will cool down again, but they haven't yet. And then the natural forcings, so solar radiance is one of these. You can get increases in solar energy from time to time, but they make the entire atmosphere heat up. But we've only got warming in the bottom layer because of our greenhouse gases. So our global warming at the moment is not due to this solar radiance. And then, of course, we've got volcanic eruptions, and the volcanoes produce particles that cool the Earth down because the smoke is kind of shielding us from the sun. And of course, the carbon dioxide that warms up. And but the overall effect of a volcano, interestingly, is cooling, not warming. And volcanoes produce about 50 times less carbon dioxide than humans do. So what we're worrying about are our greenhouse gases. They trap heat in the atmosphere and stop it escaping, acting as a warming blanket around the Earth. And without these natural greenhouse gases, we'd be 30 degrees colder and the planet would be uninhabitable for humans. But since the Industrial Revolution, we've been pouring in far more greenhouse gas. So we're now heating the planet very fast. And these gases, as you know, are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And the CFCs, which remember came from fridges and so on, and which I think we've now largely got rid of, stopped producing. So the evidence about carbon dioxide and methane comes from the Antarctic ice cores. A number of countries have got these scientific stations down in the Antarctic, and they're giving us an amazing supply of evidence about global warming. And they've shown that there's been a very tight coupling of climate change and carbon dioxide levels over the last 800,000 years. And the recent rise in carbon dioxide that we've now got is hugely anomalous compared with the natural shifts over previous millennia. So we're now seeing carbon dioxide levels that haven't been seen in the last 2 million years. So generally speaking, carbon dioxide was stable, but then started to rise in the early 1900s. And the concentration is now 40 times higher than it was before the Industrial Revolution. And when we look at the isotopic data from this carbon dioxide trapped in the ice cores, in recent years, it's all come from fossil fuel usage and deforestation. So it's a good kind of detective story, really. We're fast approaching or even passing frightening temperature tipping points. If we go beyond a certain temperature, the land ecosystems will switch from soaking up carbon dioxide to bringing it into the atmosphere. Basically, the plants will keep respiring and it'll be too hot to photosynthesize. So we need to curb global warming now rather than at some mid to long-term future. So it keeps worrying me whenever we say we're going to reach net zero by 2050. Generally speaking, that's too late. And so if we don't move fast, the land ecosystems won't be able to continue to offset the emissions we're producing. So the human causes of climate change, there's burning the fossil fuels, of course, oil, gas, and coal, all contain carbon dioxide, which has been locked away in the ground for thousands of years, and we're now busy releasing it. forests remove and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So every time we cut down a forest, it means carbon dioxide builds up quicker in the atmosphere because there's no trees to absorb it. And then when we burn that tree as well, it releases more carbon dioxide. Now, agriculture turns out to be much more important than I ever understood previously. Animals produce methane, as you know, and that's 30 times more powerful than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. But fertilizers contain nitrous oxide, and that's 10 times worse than methane and 300 times worse than carbon dioxide. And then cement is responsible for about 2% of our carbon dioxide emissions as well. So every time we build something, we're contributing to greenhouse gases as well. And of course, wildfires, and we've just seen the horrific wildfire in LA. Climate change makes wildfires much more likely, and wildfires have produced about 8 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year for the last 20 years. And when global carbon dioxide output's calculated, scientists don't include all wildfire emissions as net emissions because apparently some of it's offset by renewed forest growth afterwards. And I have seen for myself in Australia how a year after a bad forest fire, there is astonishing regeneration, which does give us a little bit of hope. But anyway, as a result, it's estimated that wildfires make up about 5 to 10% of annual global carbon dioxide emissions each year. So if we think about agriculture now, carbon dioxide is only a small part of agricultural emissions, which are mostly dominated by nitrous oxide. And the nitrous oxide comes from fertilizers spread on fields, both synthetic fertilizer and animal manure. And there's the methane, which is produced by, as you know, cows and sheep burping as they chew the cud. Methane lasts in the atmosphere for about 10 years, so it contributes to short-term warming, and we have to factor it into the total carbon budget. But nitrous oxide lasts for 100 years, and so definitely needs to be factored in. So the horrifying fact for me was that even if we stop using fossil fuels now, this minute, turn off our central heating and our energy supplies and so on, we will still miss 1.5 degrees. We've just about missed it now, and we'll nearly miss 2 degrees centigrade from agricultural emissions alone. So the atmospheric concentration of methane is more industrial levels, and it comes from fossil fuels, ruminant animals, and from landfills. And in total, those now exceed wetlands, which naturally produce a bit of methane as well. And the concentration of methane is higher than any period in the last 800,000 years. So climate change interacts with other factors to exacerbate pressures on our biodiversity. So there's the habitat loss, changes in food availability, not just for us, but for all the other species of plants and animals. It interacts with the pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides that we use on the land as well, which are all combining to destroy our soil. Contributes to disease, and of course it enables competition with invasives. We have invasive species, for example, coming into the UK, mosquitoes carrying malaria, for example. So in just over the last 40 years, wildlife populations have shown a dramatic decline, about 70% on average. And the IPCC reports that around 20 to 30% of species could die out if global mean temperatures go up by between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees. Our extreme weather events are happening more often, and This means that the timing of biological events is changing as well, the sort of breeding timings and so on of different species. So our wildlife's disappearing, but its impact isn't felt the same across the planet. So some regions and some species are much more at risk than others. And climate change is having a greater impact on the poles and on the tropical rainforests and on coastal areas than in other places. But we're all seeing changes. So trapped heat leads to habitat loss on land and sea. Our polar ice caps and glaciers are melting, causing sea levels to rise and encroach on coastal habitats and the Arctic tundra. Rainfall patterns are being affected, leading to desertification when grasslands and shrublands are slowly turning into deserts. The Sahara is expanding. In the oceans, carbon dioxide concentrations are now much higher than they've been in the last million years. And so our seas are getting warmer and we're getting this mass coral bleaching, which is terribly worrying. Especially on the Great Barrier Reef, but elsewhere as well. And climate change disrupts the natural rhythms amongst different plant and animal species. Animals often take their cues from the environment when they're deciding when to migrate or when to reproduce. So any big changes in weather patterns means that these biological events fall out of sync and happen at different times. So, for example, birds might arrive at breeding grounds when the food source is scarcer, and that can threaten their survival as well as their breeding efforts. I look after 127 nest boxes for pied flycatchers, and these are a small bird that migrate to the UK from West Africa every year to breed, and they come because of the plentiful supply of grubs and caterpillars that we have living on our oak trees, on the oak leaves. But the caterpillars are appearing earlier and they're pupating earlier. So the birds have started to arrive earlier, but the caterpillars aren't around for long enough for the birds to feed their young. So it's a mismatch really between the bird and its food supply because of climate change. Climate events are destroying our habitats and wildlife. So these tragic events are not only affecting humans, but they'll also be destroying habitats and kill wildlife. And I expect we'll learn later in the year about the impact on Los Angeles wildlife. The Australian bushfires a few years ago burnt nearly 20 million hectares of land, killing 3 billion animals, including koalas, wombats, kangaroos, and wallabies. And of course, the long-term effect on the remaining survivors and humans is incalculable. Floods can drown animals that are hibernating. So, for example, in the UK, we have animals like hedgehogs that drown in floods. Heavy rain can wash out insects, which supply food for the birds and bats. So a little bit of rain's good for insect supply, but too much and they're washed out, and then there's nothing for the birds and the bats to eat. Some of our reptiles wake up in the winter because of the warm weather, and then that exhausts them when they ought to be hibernating and gathering their strength for the spring. And climate change affects the soil. So soil processes like nitrogen, mineralization, the litter decomposition, the breaking down of the leaves and so on into humus in the soil, and soil respiration. These are all sensitive to temperature and water content. If the atmospheric carbon dioxide level goes up, that increases plant photosynthesis and growth, which increases the available biomass, and that increases the abundance of fungi and abundance of animals that are eating the plants. But then drought directly damages the soil fungi and the bacteria. And by reducing the plant litter and root growth, it decreases the abundance of most microbes in the soil. And extreme events like drought and wildfires lead to a loss of carbon from the vegetation and soils, especially peatlands. So rainfall and flooding on the soil result in soil compaction, runoff of the soil nutrients, and a lack of oxygen in the soil. And that leads to a loss of the soil's structural stability and of the nutrients in the soil. Climate change creates pathways for the introduction and spread of invasive species, and often they're introduced by human activity. And so they move into new habitats, compete with the native species for food, shelter, and space, and they can introduce new diseases as well. So we can get an increase in pests. So, for example, in the UK, we're getting a spread of blue tongue virus from this biting midge. And we're getting an increase of our tick-borne diseases, which are carried by a number of mammals, including deer. And we get an increase in human-wildlife conflict. As wild habitats shrink and food sources become scarce, the animals have to move closer and closer to human settlements. So there's increased interactions between humans and wildlife, resulting in loss of crops and livestock and loss of the animals and human lives involved. So you see that with tigers, with elephants and so on, and also a risk of disease transmission between animals and humans. Genetic diversity matters because only then have you got a potential for adaptation to climate change. So these climate change-driven changes in phenology and the distribution and population sizes are already altering the amount and distribution of genetic diversity, which represents the raw material for natural selection. So where you've got a small population already with a lot of inbreeding, there'll be low genetic diversity, and that makes for much less opportunity for evolutionary adaptation to changing conditions. So that'll make it much more likely that that species will go extinct and not survive. So the extinction of species is probably the most worrying effect of climate change, and species are disappearing between 1,000 and 10,000 times higher than what's natural. And our current estimates suggest that wildlife populations have declined by an average of about 70% since 1970. And the most at-risk species are those with limited climate ranges, like polar bears and Arctic foxes. And we've all seen those, documentaries of polar bears struggling as the polar ice is melting, and they're having to swim much farther distances to get back onto another ice sheet. Galapagos giant tortoises and marine iguanas, also good examples of having very limited climate ranges. Other human activities like deforestation, especially in the Amazon, and overfishing, great causes for concern. And the loss of species reduces biodiversity, but it also indicates that the overall ecosystem is breaking down. So if we carry on as we are, there's a risk of global system failure unless we take urgent action. So, for example, if we lose our bees, we may lose all the plants that they pollinate. And then this then affects all the animals that eat those plants, including humans. So a world without bees could mean a rise in global food insecurity unless we take urgent action. Now, our global food systems produce about a third of greenhouse gases, 17 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents in 2019. And they come from farming and land use, the crops and the livestock, household food consumption and waste, and the energy used in farm, food processing and transportation. And although these sectors altogether, these sectors generated 21% of the world's carbon dioxide, over half of all methane, and over 3/4 of all nitrous oxide emissions globally. So, as I mentioned earlier, agriculture is really important for us to consider. And livestock's the main contributor to agricultural emissions. So global livestock generates 14.5% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And cattle are largely responsible for the majority of these emissions, largely methane. And the storage of manure in large lagoons also emits methane, as well as the ruminant animals. Emissions also come from producing and processing animal feed and tilling the land to grow crops, which releases carbon dioxide stored in the soil. So they're now encouraging the farmers in the UK to stop ploughing and just drill the seeds in rather than plough. And activities to support agriculture, like chopping trees down or digging up our peatlands, generates another enormous contribution of carbon dioxide, 3.5 billion metric tons a year. And when forests are cleared for raising livestock or growing crops, the stored carbon is all released into the atmosphere. So deforestation is responsible for 80% of emissions from food production in Brazil. Peatlands store massive amounts of carbon, twice as much as the world's forest, but we're busy draining and burning peatlands for growing crops or livestock grazing. So that's responsible for about 5% of our emissions. And food waste is another major contributor. About a third of all food grown in the world is wasted. It's a terrible statistic. About 13% between the harvest and retail stages, and then 17%, the majority, in our own households, our own homes, and the food service and retail sectors. So that wasted food, which includes the energy used to produce it and transport it, spoilage along the way, and what we throw out of our fridges, generates about half of all global food system emissions. And a good chunk of those emissions are caused by the methane formed when food rots in landfill. So if we can reduce our own household waste, this would be a major help. The consequences of climate change are much more severe in low and middle income countries, which have more extreme weather events like wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, and floods, food insecurity, reduction of the biodiversity, an increase in pests, and an impact on health. And low and middle income countries also have higher rates of people living livelihoods which are much more sensitive to climate change, often in countries with challenges of governance, higher levels of conflict, and more limited health services. So many reasons why the consequences are greater in low and middle income countries. I'm not going to spend too much time on these slides, these three, because they're detailed, but they're there for those who are interested in showing the major contributors to carbon dioxide, to nitrous oxide, and to methane. Climate change is often gradual and on a large scale. So when we want to research its effect on mental health, it's quite difficult to design suitable studies. And we're looking for our mental health changes. It means we need long-term studies, which are difficult to get funding for and difficult to design. There are complex biopsychosocial pathways that contribute to mental health. So the mental health effects might be the results of displacement or poverty that have been triggered or exacerbated by the climate change, rather than just the direct effects of the temperature. So we need large-scale data sets that we can analyse carefully. WHO considers that climate change is a social determinant of mental health, and this reflects the view that the risk factors also mental disorders are strongly associated with social inequities. And vulnerable and marginalised groups are at higher risk of climate-induced mental health problems than the general population. At least we think they probably will be. So some of the direct effects of climate change on mental health have been stress-related and trauma, particularly with these acute events following hurricanes, floods, and wildfires. I've actually been flooded 3 times now in the course of my life. Once about 20 years ago, and twice just in this last autumn. And it is quite stressful, just kind of dealing with the aftermath. And then there are the indirect effects, more insidious changes related to physical health, the increased ambient temperature. And so, particularly for people like the elderly, we're not coping with extremely high temperatures so well, or extreme cold, as well as we could do when we were younger. Increased pollen, dust, or pollution in the air affects our physical health and then also mental health. And then there can be community effects from the economic damage on the local community. There may be conflict over scarce resources of food or land. Some of the recent conflicts in the Middle East have actually been about land use and water supply, as well as other things. Migration due to loss of habitable land. So as the Sahara expands, then people will have to move to find somewhere possible to live. And of course, there can be helplessness, worry, and fear. So the studies have found that heat, humidity, extra rainfall, drought, wildfires, and floods are all associated with psychological distress, worse mental health, higher mortality in people with pre-existing mental disorders, increased rates of psychiatric hospital admissions, and increased suicide rates. But the effect of climate change on mental health is going to depend a lot on contextual factors as well. So the local, social, cultural, economic, and developmental context. The spatial distribution of exposure, the type of event, the duration and the severity of the event, how bad it was, how long it lasted, and what the associated consequences were for physical health and the community well-being. But the mental health consequences, for example, after floods, can last 5 or 10 years. So you remember the flood Katrina in Florida, and so that's been studied for many years now. And the PTSD and so on can be very long-lasting. And of course, some of us have much more protection from these events than others. When I've been flooded, I've been insured. But of course, many people in, for example, Bangladesh, when the coast floods, there is no insurance. It's much more catastrophic in an event in poorer countries. Climate change contributes to human conflict, can lay the groundwork for in Syria, prolonged droughts and water scarcity aggravated the social tensions that may have contributed to the outbreak of the civil war. And there's a broader pattern where climate change exacerbates conflict, where regions are already vulnerable to social, economic, and political instability. And then different communities are fighting over access to agricultural land and land for mineral resources and so on. So climate change can act as a threat multiplier, really, intensifying the grievances and competition over dwindling natural resources and magnifying pre-existing economic, racial, or ethnic and health disparities by disproportionately affecting vulnerable and marginalised populations who are already at risk of psychiatric disorders. And in areas plagued by water scarcity anyway, such as Palestine, which we're all familiar with now, the access to water heightens the terrible tensions, and there's another aggravating problem. As habitats become uninhabitable due to extreme weather events, sea levels rise, and with desertification, millions are forced to leave their homes. So this climate displacement is a growing crisis. And the World Bank projects that by 2050, there could be 216 million internal climate migrants across sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, the Pacific, South Asia, North Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. So the migration becomes a survival strategy. It's a response to the loss of livelihoods, food insecurity, and the deterioration of living conditions. So climate change is increasingly driving migration, and it's visible in the trends observed globally. And for example, the Pacific Islands are facing existential threats from the rising sea levels, and it's already affecting the migration flows away from those islands as residents move to safer grounds. When we look at biodiversity loss and mental health, most research has been in the high-income countries, with only a few in low and middle-income countries. But again, we need to look at this association in the context of local cultural and religious beliefs, the community structures, the previous urban and rural exposure over the life course, because it makes a difference whether you're used to living in a city or whether you've only recently had to adjust to it, and the usual socioeconomic variables. So, for example, one study found that the people living in the lowest amount of green space in the city had a 24% chance of developing schizophrenia, which is very high. And obviously, it's the association can go. It's going to go both ways, and there would be the drift hypothesis as well. Albrecht introduced this concept of psychoterratic syndromes. So psychological syndromes caused by what's happening in the landscape and the biodiversity around. So he named eco-anxiety, eco-guilt, eco-paralysis, ecological grief, solastalgia, which is due to this concern about the deteriorating biosphere and the future for future generations. So my daughter probably has all of these things really, and is desperately concerned about the future for my little 10-year-old grandson. In Africa, there's we see a lot of land and livelihoods. There are physical and mental health consequences for internally displaced people and refugees. People can experience a kind of homesickness. The environment's changed so much that it no longer looks like home. And the cultural ties between people and their land seems to be disintegrating. So see, these are some of the things reported by our psychiatric colleagues in Kenya and Tanzania. Some communities are developing coping strategies from indigenous and local knowledge to withstand climate change impacts. So, for example, they're developing weather forecasting systems based on changes in the animal behaviour. And they're doing their best to diversify livestock and crops, and introducing management techniques to manage the stress amongst the cattle because of climate change. So there are major efforts at adaptation and coping, but it's still extremely stressful. the studies find that if you give people exposure to more plant diversity, it reduces stress. It can improve memory and concentration, and increase positive social interactions, can improve social cohesion, improve mood, self-esteem, subjective well-being, even improve academic performance, imagination and creativity, improve sleep, reduce rates of mental disorders. And there's something called the biophilia hypothesis. So the restorative effects of biodiversity are thought to relate to human evolution. So throughout the time we've evolved, our species has relied on a variety of other species for our survival and reproduction. So this hypothesis is suggesting that humans have an innate affinity to connect to other species and nature, and higher biodiversity might be suggesting to us that it's a safe environment where this variety of species means that our needs can be met, and that is psychologically good for us. And whereas if species are extinct and we know that we don't have enough food and the ecosystem is unstable, then this is going to not be good for our mental health. But anyway, it's not well understood really how contact with biodiversity does lead to better mental health and well-being. But most of the studies that have now been done do show this beneficial relationship between the number and abundance of species and self-reported well-being, pleasure, connectedness to nature, overall health, and reduced stress, anxiety, and depression. Now, high-income countries are largely responsible for this climate change disaster that we've got, but the greatest impact is on low and middle-income countries, where there are the fewest health workers to deal with the consequences. And as you'll know, the richer countries are still extracting health workers from the low and middle-income countries because the rich countries have still failed to produce their own sustainable supply of health workers. So this is another, of course, huge scandal which WHO has done its best to address with an agreement in 2010 with the rich countries to stop draining poor countries of its health workers. But the problem still continues, and the UK particularly is a great offender in this regard. So what can we all do? We can try and move towards a whole food, plant-based diet. You'll remember agriculture is contributing a third of greenhouse gases, and those are coming from the animal agriculture, from the cattle and the sheep and the chickens and so on. So that would mitigate greenhouse gases by up to 80%, as well as being much better for our physical and mental health. Studies have shown that, contrary to what we all thought, we don't need all this meat, and it's much better for us to eat plants. We can reduce our personal use of fossil fuels. We can use Zoom rather than travel to meetings, stop zipping around the world, going to all these conferences. We want to lobby our governments so that they subsidise insulation and the use of geothermal and solar power. We can integrate climate change issues into our clinical practice, the way we develop our health services, and into research and policy development. And you'll remember that doctors led the way with smoking, with giving up smoke. Well, they led the way with smoking, first of all. Then they led the way with giving up smoking. And we now need similar leadership in giving up fossil fuels and our dependence on eating animals. Wind turbines are probably a good thing. They're responsible for far less carbon emissions than coal or natural gas-fired power plants. Electric vehicles are better than petrol or diesel. There are already some countries that already rely on nearly 100% renewable energy. So Costa Rica, Norway, Iceland, Paraguay, and Uruguay power their grids now with hydro, geothermal, wind, and solar energy. So they're good examples for the rest of us. And some provinces in Australia, Canada, and China, for example, are already using nearly 100% renewables. Um, so there is progress. If we think about the UK at the moment, 71% of our land is used for agriculture, and most of that is being used for animals, but it's 85% it's being used for animals, but it's only producing a third of our calories. So if we stop producing those all those animals and just produce the plants instead, we would need less land for agriculture, and then we could put aside more land for biodiversity. So this is what's underlying recent policy changes in farming practice in the UK at the moment. There's huge resistance from our farmers, I may say, um, but the policymakers are working on it slowly. Yeah. Um, and this is an interesting paper you might like to make a note of, looking at the association between natural biodiversity and mental well-being. So thank you. That's the talk. And yes, I think that there's another study you also might like. So I'll try and come out of this. There we go.
Do you want to go ahead, Dr. Blunt?
Well, I'm scared. I'm frightened. I don't know what to say. Uh, my mental health has gone worse.
Has plummeted. I know it's very depressing talk, isn't it? It's frightening.
Frightening, yes, indeed.
Mm.
But still, you have said some important hints. You have talked about some important hints,
Mm.
which we must focus on, I think. I missed the last one about, which was about, I think, phone using.
Oh, it was a study. I'll have to get it back. Let me just see. Yeah, they just used smartphones to, I think, work out where people were spatially. So it was just a way of associating at an individual level the biodiversity and the mental state of individuals in a large scale study. So it was an interesting research technique. That was all. Um, so it's, yes,
Yeah,
I can't tell you more at this stage about the study, sorry, but I thought people might be interested to read it as I
thank you.
zipped past it.
I think something we have to do is raise awareness about this situation. But if we continue frightening, I think the reaction would be just leave it alone. It won't hurt me when I'm still in this world. I mean, there must be a smooth way of getting people to do something.
Mm, mm.
Would you
I
agree?
think governments have to take a lead for sure, because there are some things that only governments can do. Um, and like change the direction of energy policy for the country, change the direction of agricultural policy, and so on. And have useful incentives like for buying electric cars rather than petrol ones. Um, but there's also individual choices we can all make. And if we spread the word in our teaching and our clinical interactions and so on, then we can make a difference. You know, the news needs to travel. It was only when I put this talk together that I understood about the importance of agriculture. I didn't know that information before. And so our newspapers are not doing a good job in educating us, really. So we and I once took a journalist to task about this. He was a retired journalist from the Financial Times, which is probably our most prestigious newspaper, you know. And I said something about the journalists haven't served us well over the last 20 or 30 years. They should have been explaining about climate change, and they haven't. And he said, well, it's difficult to make an exciting story out of 1 degree centigrade. But actually, he's not right. That 1 degree centigrade is a terrifying story. And the journalists had a responsibility to educate us, and they didn't. Um, so now I think we've got to pick up the baton and run with it, you know, and educate our friends, our colleagues, our students, our patients, and that we have to take action. Otherwise, our grandchildren don't have a life.
Yeah, I also want to make a point there. Like, I mean, from my childhood, I mean, in our school or in our university, like, I never really that much came face to
Mm,
face with climate change or like it affects. Like, I have never like, I didn't have any idea or I didn't have any anxiety. But like these days, with attending some conferences or like with studying it by myself, I see there's so much stuff changing, and I also see that there's so many children that
mm,
have climate
mm,
anxiety, as you said, like which I have never experienced.
mm,
But like I start to actually kind of experience it
mm,
recently. So yeah, that's also really I mean scaring. But
mm,
yeah, to what Dr. Blunt said, I recently come across with one psychiatrist, child psychiatrist, like writing one book like related for climate anxiety for only children, and just kind of try to explain the main
mm,
terms for related to climate change and try to make the smooth change that Dr. Plant mentioned for making them to take action, not scaring of it, but also to try to make some actions. And thank you, Dr. Rachel. It's really very informing. I took some notes like related biophilia hypothesis, which I think is really
mm,
interesting.
mm.
And I
It
think
is,
it,
isn't it?
yeah, yeah, it has some like psychological and like philosophical, I think,
Mm,
background kind of. I mean, from my own experience, when I make some food like with mo more like diverse
mm.
like greens or stuff, I felt much more pleasure from it.
Yes.
But when I only make a cook like from only like one
Mm.
food type, it's just
Yeah,
like yeah,
yeah.
even from that experience, you feel that there's something related with biodiversity deep down.
Yes, and of course, yes, they say we should have 30 different plants a week or something. Yes, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yes.
that's true. And I don't know if you're like if you're familiar with the work of Björk. She's from Iceland too. She's a musician. She also had like some albums related, like named
Mhm.
Biophilia. And her other albums are also like related to nature. Yeah, I would just
No, I didn't. Can you send me a link or something? Yes.
yeah, I can just like write the name of her and the name of
Mm.
album. Um, yeah, I wrote them to the chat. Both of these
Lovely.
albums are highly related with like biodiversity and like climate
Yes.
change.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, I think um, just talking to other people about it all kind of helps. You never know what triggers ideas in people and so on. You know, there's yes. I'm sort of a believer in a grassroots movement, you know, that and when voters get sufficiently concerned, then the politicians may do something.
yeah, exactly true.
It's very hard, probably, to draw the attention of the politicians. You
Yeah,
know,
I've discovered Well, in relation to, I haven't taken it up in relation to climate change, but when I've been deeply concerned about the UK not producing enough doctors, so we keep poaching from poor countries. Um, First of all, I just kept writing to my MP and writing to the Department of Health. Nothing happened. So I started writing to the newspapers, and that's when people started to take notice. So, yeah, so at some point you kind of almost have to go rogue, and it's like Greta Thunberg, when she started sitting outside Parliament, people noticed. But if she just stayed off school protesting, then yeah. So you have to do something that people will pay attention to. So I think letters in newspapers helps.
Yeah,
It just reaches a wider audience, and politicians sometimes read them. Yeah.
but it's interesting. The example you gave, the retired person from financial.
Times, yes.
Uh, I
He
don't.
didn't see that it was a big story, but the more you look into it and to granular detail, it is. I mean, the other thing I haven't shown you, is because I did a more detailed talk for my local county on climate change in Herefordshire over the last 100 years. And I got the climate data 100 years ago, which was collected by some monks in a monastery. And so I got all this handwritten data for temperature and rainfall 100 years ago and compared it with now. And even though the overall temperature change has only been like 1.5 degrees or something, if you look at it month by month, the changes are enormous. So there was a big story to be told if only the journalists had looked into it, if only they'd done what I'd done, and yes, delve deeper into the data.
I would like to repeat the question. Should there be a better way of raising awareness other than frightening people? Because similarly, for smoking issue,
Mm.
as you continue frightening people, they stop caring more about that. I,
Um,
yeah.
Yes, so you need the carrot, not the stick, as it were. Well, somebody, yes, it's a very good question. And the carrot in relation to giving up meat, a meat-based diet, is that a plant-based diet is much better for you. So I'll email one of the papers in International Psychiatry a few years ago reviewed the evidence that a plant-based diet is excellent for mental health, as well as physical health. So I'll send that paper round. Yeah. So yeah, so there are positive things we can say about a plant-based diet. There's positive things we can say about encouraging biodiversity and access to biodiversity. Um,
The topic seemed very interesting to me,
mm,
but we have very few participants. I hope it will be watched on YouTube. And well, I had some friends who said they would come and follow this.
mm.
Probably they have decided to follow it later.
Ah, right. Yes, it's the recording. Yes. Well, it's a shame they're not here to discuss. Yes. Um, but
Yeah. I am glad to be here and like participate and have a chance to discuss it with you.
no, it's great, Fahad. Thank you. And yes, and maybe it's an issue we can come back to
I
again.
agree.
Yeah,
I
I
agree.
think it is something also for the World Psychiatric Association, the other medical associations to pick up. Because when you think, of 2,000 people jetting into a city somewhere in the world on a regular basis, and the carbon footprint of that, it's significant. And And it's lovely, of course, meeting colleagues. It's very special, and I treasure all the times that I did it, you know. Um, but now times are different, and I think we have to think about operating in a different way.
I'm glad we didn't come to listen to you to UK, and we are doing it
Yes,
Zoom.
yes, exactly. We're doing it virtually. Yes. Here's a question. What about the role of oh, it's popped back again. I've lost it. I think it was about the role
What
of
it,
religion.
it's written, what about the role of religions and church with the relation to raising awareness to this problem?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And the Pope has actually written a major encyclical a few years ago um, on climate change and biodiversity and pollution and so on. So I think he has tried to take something of a lead, and other religions probably have done something similar. Just hold on a moment, and I can actually give you a bit more information.
Mariana asked this question. Maybe she can also, if possible, uh, put on the video and we can listen to her, if possible.
Um, I'll tell you something which will make you smile. For the last 2 or 3 years, I've organized a crazy thing, which is a voyage down the River Wye of a statue of the Virgin Mary to raise awareness about the river pollution in the river, because the river is very polluted from agriculture, from chicken manure, fertilizer, and so on. So it's losing its fish and its biodiversity. It used to be the best river in the world for salmon, and it no longer is. And it's often a kind of green pea soup. So I don't, this is the book of the voyage, and so this statue, that's our beautiful River Wye, which the statue went down. It was a 5-day voyage. But anyway, in producing this book, I looked at exactly this questions that's been asked about what um, religion and culture can do. So somebody called Thich Nhat Hanh has written Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet. Pope Francis did this encyclical in 2015, and I quote, "The earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. The issue of environmental degradation challenges us to examine our lifestyle." Um, Patriarch Bartholomew, in an address in California in 1997, um, said for human beings to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, for human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the earth of its natural forests and destroying its wetlands, for humans to contaminate the earth's waters, its land, its air, and its life, these are sins. And then somebody at a professor of sustainability science at the University of Nottingham in 2022 said there's potential for faith to mobilize social environmental change, but it's usually left out of conversations about sustainability. And humanity's ability to avert environmental catastrophe will depend on sustainability becoming embedded into every institution and cultural setting, and religion is no exception. Um, so, and I did get chapters in this book written by different religions. So I got two chapters from Muslim contributors, one from a Jewish contributor, one from an Eastern Orthodox contributor, etc. So yes, I think religion has a big part to play, and some of them are stepping up. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Maybe could you show the book once more?
Yes. In fact, you can't, I mean, I can post a copy to you. It was like self-published. So you can't, it's not on Amazon, sadly. Um, but I would happily send a few copies across if yes.
Yeah,
It's a kind
have
of
a
community produced book, as it were.
community produced book.
Yes. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. But it was a way of it was an environmental protest that didn't mean I had to go to prison. and and so we had this 5 foot statue on 2 canoes like a catamaran, and it was rowed down the River Wye over 5 days, stopping off for various events along the way. And it happens in all, it was first done 2 or 3 years ago. So we'll do it again this summer. And the first year we did it, we got a lot of media coverage. So we were in all the big newspapers, and the BBC and the BBC World Service covered it as well. And it was the silly season, so there was nothing else happening. But it did attract attention, and it provoked 2 or 3 of our national newspapers to then have a campaign about cleaning up British rivers, which still continues. The campaign continues. The rivers still aren't cleaned, but the pressures on our water companies and on agriculture have stepped up now. Yeah.
That's actually a great example how like change can start and like with even like little movement. That's
Yes,
so
and it
yeah,
was a kind a sort of crazy thing to do. And I kept feeling embarrassed. My colleagues will think I've gone mad, as I was kind of roadie for this event.
but
Yeah.
I mean you need to do that kind of stuff to draw the attention. So
Mm.
that's the point. I mean, yeah.
I think before we close, there is another question.
What was the question?
Yeah, I can read it if you
Yeah.
want. The other issue is doctors that have been imprisoned or are going through trial
Mm.
sentence after taking part in protests against climate change. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think our justice system has been much too heavy-handed. The long sentences they've been given have been outrageous, and there are appeals going on at the moment, I think, about that. But also, I think it's helpful to think of ways of bringing the problem to attention that don't alienate a lot of people. It's a bit like Bulent was saying, if you alienate people, it can have a sort of the reverse effect of what you want to do. So I think it is good to try and think of eye-catching things that won't entail having to go to prison, basically.
Yeah.
It's difficult. It's difficult, and otherwise one feels people aren't listening and so on. Um, but um, but one doesn't want to have had a paradoxical effect, where everybody just gets fed up with the eco-protesters and dig their heels in more and more to not change their ways. So we have to think of carrots, not sticks, and inspiration rather than I don't know what the opposite is.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Rachel.
Uh,
Yeah.
I'm afraid we will have to stop here to wait for another meeting to discuss another dimension of this issue. Thank you.
And thank you to Mariana for her questions as well. Yeah, very helpful. I'm glad I got the opportunity to show you this, and I'll show you. Yeah, I don't know if you can see that. That's the statue with the rowers um, in the kind of canoe catamaran.
Ah,
Is it possible to see it?
I
Yeah,
think.
we kind of see it
Yeah,
actually. Yeah.
yeah.
Can we get your email address, Dr. Rachel, so we can email you and you can send it?
Yes, yes.
I
It's
can share it.
Rachel, Rachel,
Yes.
at OLAN, Orange Lima Alpha November,
After at Rachel at and
at Orange Lima Alpha November.org.
oln.org.
OLAN.
AN. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.